清楚。咁但係佢唔係飲醉酒啊。嗱咁救護員就扶佢啦。咁你都講到係話要係送廣華醫院㗎啦。唔似飲醉酒啊！而家睇緊啊，咁佢係冇戴口罩㗎，因為兩位救護員係協助緊佢。咁我哋見到呢位男子身穿一件黃色衫，建築公司嘅一啲字樣喺上面，係任職喺建築公司嘅，可能做係一啲裝修啊等等工作。咁佢啱啱咧就係強行離開啦，去到百老匯鐵閘之後又瞓低，身上亦都有啲物件跌咗出嚟啦，亦都冇理會到係途人將啲物件幫佢執翻嘅。冇影啦！乜撚嘢冇影啫？我做緊影啫。呢啲傻嘅唔使理啦。係呀，唔係嘅。得唔得啊？咁佢都係有少少步伐不穩，咁亦都有救護員想叫的士車佢，但係就未知嘅情緒係，我真係等過你，我收工路過呀。嗯？我以為今日21號，即係有啲記者專登出旺角啊、元朗啊。之前有。喺邊度可以？哦，得啦，自己得啦，明啊，自己有。咁都係睇下的士啱啱車佢嘅啫。咁都問一問睇下肯唔肯車啊？唔係個個車㗎，你都神志不清啊嘛。你去咗都唔知有冇接俾喎。有少少係激動啊！今日咪你知先，你唔知，你都話俾你聽啦，我做係咁樣。毒人士嚟嘅，唔係吸毒人士。咁佢都係決定自己離開㗎。半身係失平衡㗎，同埋係半身即係類似係一邊手冇力㗎。咁救護員都係勸喻無效啊！咁多番叫佢白車咧去呢一個。廣華醫院咧都係唔肯聽，咁佢一路向前行就係咁。另外就多架的士係佢載啊。咁我哋直播暫時喺呢度啊。咁多謝，拜拜。呢度交代多次啦，我哋就佢係多次拒絕入醫院嘅。係不斷咁係左搖右擺啦，佢一去到先達廣場啊。好，我哋直播去到呢度，多謝大家收睇。咁我哋件事點發生嗰啲，你睇翻係 review 啦。咁啊，主要係有位男子就喺西洋菜南街近新城嗰個位置咧，就係瞓低咗。咁其後有休班護士啦協助佢，但係咁最後佢都係拒絕送院㗎。救護員嚟到勸阻無效嘅情況之下，但唔係關任何嘅一啲私了啊或者其他事件嘅。好，多謝大家收睇《天鴿報》，拜拜。
Sometimes there are things that get me down. They can be hard to deal with. But I try not to worry too much about the things that I can't change. So I just accept them.
You're watching Talking Point on Strat News Global. I'm Amitabh Revi. Well, I'm joined by former Foreign Secretary Kanwal Sibal. Thank you so much. From Singapore, also by Professor James Crabtree. He's an author. He's the Associate Professor at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at NUS in Singapore. He's a writer. Raj, he's been a journalist as well. He still is. He writes quite often. And from London, we joined live by Benedict Rogers, a human rights activist and a writer as well. Thank you, all three of you, for joining us. Mr. Sibal, I just wanted to get you in first. One of the cornerstones in India policy was that differences should not be allowed to change into disputes. Now that's, as many would say, that it's been buried in the Galwan Valley. There are a lot of options that India has going forward. The national mood, you've all seen how it is. But just take us through how do two nuclear powers, even though militarily there is a complete dispute, and China, even though we are catching up in many fronts, and there's no way that our sovereignty will, the resolve that the armed forces have vis-a-vis that. But militarily-wise, where do you see India's options currently?
You must recognize that the area in which the confrontation is taking place is very remote, very high, very inhospitable, where the forces need a lot of acclimatization, where you can't, in fact, because of the terrain, put in a large number of forces. Maybe you can put in a brigade, nothing more. And a brigade, however strong China may be, can't do very much in these high altitudes. At best, 1 kilometer here, 2 kilometers here, nothing more than that. That's not a run India's position, and that applies to India too. We can defend ourselves, but if we went on the offensive, we don't have that capacity, and we can't push back China very large because it's a question of replenishment. It's a question of then moving the fresh troops and then taking artillery and this and that at these altitudes is phenomenally difficult. So even though China, in the macro terms, may be a strong military power, but the force that they can bring to bear at the border is strictly limited, number one. Number two, they have a lot of vulnerabilities, and especially when it comes to the Air Force. Airfields at very high altitude, what the planes can carry in terms of anything else is limited. And then I think you would know from open sources that the Chinese airfields and aircraft are positioned in the open. They are not under solid bunker or whatever else it is. They're all lined up. So actually they're sitting targets. If India was to use air action, they're very vulnerable. Their tanks are all lined up, and they can be taken out. It's flat terrain. It's open. It's visible. So clearly, one should think in terms of the two countries bringing all their military forces to bear on this conflict. And then, of course, there is the sea dimension where China is vulnerable. Now, what will happen is that this confrontation will go on. China has prepared this very well. They couldn't have moved in at 4 or 5 points with such large number of troops, and with a lot of preparation beforehand, and now see being effected on the ground in terms of putting tents and prefers and building bunkers and everything else. So which means that they've started planning this well in winter itself. And the moment the weather became better, the summer started, when movement could take place, they moved in at various points, as I said. Now, they wouldn't have done that unless they had thought through this and looked at what would be a solution to this from their end. So therefore, I feel that they're not going to withdraw. They're going to remain on their side of the line of control in strength as they are now. And our side from confrontation will go on because we've positioned ourselves all equally around. We have mirror deployments. We have now capacities to airlift our people very rapidly. The border infrastructure not be very good, but in this particular area, in Galwan, better. So stalemate, at least in the Galwan Valley, in Pangso, Pangong So, the lake, where they have entrenched themselves beyond Finger 4. and have built fortifications and taken up positions on the heights, again, they are not going to move back. They're not going to move back. So it's very difficult to understand what China's motives are. It's such an opaque country. This decision-making is so opaque. Normal logic does not apply. Internal discussion in the country about why things are being done, and some question, some different views, some contention about the wisdom of doing this thing, as happens is not visible in the Chinese think tank and media space.
Yeah.
I don't know why they are doing this. What is their bottom line? What is their calculation?
In fact, Foreign Secretary Sybil, as a symbol, let me take that question to Professor Crabtree. Professor Crabtree, I mean, there have been a lot of internal and international issues that have been raised as to why China is doing this now, opening up so many. You look at what's happening in Ladakh, you see what's happening in the southeast, in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, Japan, Australia cyber attack, which are euphemism that has been used by the Prime Minister. So why do you see this as happening currently, Professor Crabtree?
As Mr. Sybil said, it's very difficult to tell by the Chinese regime. On the one hand, what's happening is the result of local factors. The two sides have improved their infrastructure and are rubbing up against one another more closely than they used to. But there's an undeniable pattern that appears to be developing around the region, that in the aftermath of the current pandemic, China is testing its adversaries, whether that's India, whether that's in Taiwan, whether that's in the South China Sea with Indonesia and the Philippines, with what happened in Australia today with the cyber attack. And I think that's China's modus operandi. It tests, it pokes its rivals to see how they will respond, at what speed, with what level of ferocity, with what, to see what it can get away with as it's seeking to move forward in the region. And so India's dilemma now is how exactly do you respond to what's tested it, where it's tested it.
So, how would you agree now? I mean, you've reported from here, apart from studying the whole region very closely, Professor Crabtree.
Well, I think it's been very measured in the first instance. I think on both sides, or at least on the Indian side, given the economic back, there's very little desire to escalate this. But Mr. Modi faces a range of difficult choices. As Mr. Sybil said, I mean, I've been to Ladakh, but I've never seen these fortifications, but it's wretched terrain to try and move around on. So your military options are limited, and India has economic options that we can get onto, but are not very positive because of the imbalance in trade relations between China and India. So the choices are not easy and are not good. My instinct is that the two sides will probably want to try and de-escalate this, but that still leaves a lot of long questions for India about what it has learned about China's intentions from.
Well, many thought that the de-escalation process was working before what happened in the intervening night. Mr. Rogers, just to enlarge the whole discussion here in terms of what the options are, not just for India, but for various countries who are feeling this, whether you call it aggression, whether you call it muscle flexing by the Chinese on various fronts, not just in military front. Well, just in terms of what's happening, say, in the US, with the Uyghur law becoming an act signed by President Trump. Now, how important is something like that in a many-pronged approach to get China to behave according to international rules and norms?
Well, I think that new law is very important, because I think for too long there has been a tendency in general to somewhat turn a blind eye to the extremely egregious human rights crisis in China, both for the Uyghurs but across the board, that has intensified over the last few years under Xi Jinping. And part of the international response to China's repression internally, but aggression well beyond its borders, is to stand up for human rights. And so the Uyghur law need a much more robust response to the flagrant violations of the Sino-British Declaration, an international treaty lodged at the United Nations, which is now being discarded by the Declaration, an international treaty lodged at the United Nations, which is now being discarded by Beijing in terms of what they're doing to Hong Kong. So it should be a key part of the global response to China's increasing belligerence, repression, and aggression.
Ambassador Sybil, if I can come to you on that, issue itself, or how India has been caught, so as to speak. We know what our values are, the democracy, the constitution, our diversity. But when it comes to the one China policy, whether it's Tibet, whether it's Hong Kong, whether it's Taiwan, are those fronts that have to be opened in terms of diplomacy?
Well, you know, this one China is politically accommodating China. There's nothing legal about it. It is not enshrined in the UN Charter. There is no international law which doesn't have the backing of international law. It is political accommodation of China, as against which supposed to respect the territorial integrity of others. You just can't one-way street that you have to accept what I think is my rightful ownership of other people's territory, but you can't question why I am occupying illegally many parts of the territory of others. So that is one. The other is that I personally very much in favor, though I think government may not be thinking immediately in this direction, that we have to stand up to China militarily in Arunachal Pradesh or whatever it is, not yield ground, fight back, even if we suffer casualties, but enforce a stalemate. A stalemate goes against China. It punctures as a larger-than-life image because they have got away with this sort of a thing in South China Sea, and it will be demonstrated to them. They can't have this playbook, playbook operate in other areas. That's one. But doing this is not enough. We have to open up political space for ourselves, which we have yielded over the years to great disadvantage of ours. We were also supporting one China policy, even at a time when China is being claiming Arunachal Pradesh and sitting on our territory in Ladakh. And then what is worse is that Arunachal Pradesh and in Ladakh are based on the occupation of Tibet. Now, if we do not open up political space for ourselves, Tibet, then actually we are giving China opportunity to continue to stake its claims on Indian territory based on their occupation of Tibet. Therefore, I have always had a feeling we should open up politically towards the Dalai Lama much more. And again, open up to Taiwan, upgrade our relations with Taiwan. I'm a strong supporter of the idea that we should invite the Taiwanese foreign minister to India as a first step. And then we should be a little more open in terms of our criticism of what's happening in Hong Kong and what's happening in Xinjiang. And also, like Australia has done, seek transparency and accountability about this virus and where it originated. Now, we don't have to do all these things at once. But I'm strongly in favor of taking some steps in this direction to tell China that if they continue their military bullying attempts and continue to claim our territory, this is the which India will go and put on the issues on which India has so far been silent.
Right. Professor Crabtree, I can bring you in there now. Do you see that as inevitable? India has not been doing that, but you've seen the signals already with Scott Morrison, the virtual summit signing of the military logistics agreement, maybe inviting them for Malacca Quad, the Quad +3, G7 proposal to enlarge that. You have Japan, you have Vietnam, you have Philippines, all who are extremely concerned about what the Chinese are doing. Canada, Australia, in the Western Indian Ocean, UK itself, Mr. Rogers will probably talk about. You see India in its political space in those terms as well, and helping coordinate, say, a global effort to, if not contain China, to at least to get it to behave?
Yeah, I think that's quite likely. It's hard to see which of these options, but India has quite a lot of different options of ways that it could signal its unhappiness with China. India's foreign policy has moved back and forth between a concept of strategic autonomy, in which it has been since more worried about being on an even keel with China, and external balancing, trying to find new partners to act with against China. And so after the Wuhan summit, you had a period in which strategic autonomy was the flavor of the month, and in which it appeared as if maybe India and China could get along. And I think the long-term implication of what's happened over recent weeks is that you're going to go a policy of trying to find new partners, new ways of sending signals to China. Some of the things that the former foreign secretary was suggesting would obviously be very provocative. So India does have the option, making nice of opening up to Taiwan, of sending its navy further towards the South China Sea. But the problem is all of these things have consequences. And so these have to be, is very well aware, they have to be taken in a very measured way and with some anticipation of, if you tweak the tail of the tiger in China's case, then what we're trying to do in response. And so this is a very delicate exercise in signaling. But yes, in answer to your question, I think it is likely now that India is going to engage in a more full-throated attempt to build stronger alliances with other powers who are worried about China. And in particular, that means getting even closer to the United States.
Yeah, we'll just talk about that. Mr. Rogers is getting in on the question of Hong Kong, an international coalition of parliamentarians that was formed last month. I think of maybe 8 countries, the US, Canada, Japan, Sweden, Germany, the UK, all developed countries there to try and put pressure on China on the national security law. But do you see what's happening inevitable in terms of them forcing it down on Hong Kong?
I don't think it's totally inevitable. I mean, it's looking obviously at what Beijing's intentions are, but I think that if the international community really stands up very clearly and with a united voice, and more than a voice, united acts of and coordinated acts of pressure, then that may have some effect. You mentioned the coalition of parliamentarians, and I have the privilege of serving on the advisory group to this body. And I think this is a very, very exciting start because it's a very broad coalition. It will grow. You mentioned the countries that are initially there, but I hope, for example, parliamentarians from India and from other Asian countries world will join it. But it's a and geographically very broad alliance. One of the things that I've also been calling for, particularly the situation in Hong Kong, is the creation of an international contact group to bring together like-minded countries to coordinate their response to Hong Kong. Because when countries respond individually and piecemeal, that has some symbolic, much stronger if countries respond in a coordinated way. So I hope we will see that happen. And I hope countries in the region, if an international contact group is formed, I hope that governments, particularly of democracy, will join that.
And here, on how do you hurt the Chinese, where it hits them hardest? You've talked about it, Professor Capri's talked about it, Mr. Rogers also. Now, one is, as Professor Capri was also talking about, Malacca Straits, which is a choke point with over 80% of Chinese trade flowing through that. That's one option that can be utilized if need be. But all these more than pinpricks, with Hong Kong, Taiwan, the Uyghurs, how much does it hurt? This is coming from a concerted international effort, so to speak, to either force them to change their behavior in those particular circumstances, or at least force them to reconsider what they are doing in terms of their muscle flexing.
Well, I've not been able to understand why China is taking so much risk, why she is taking so much risk. Yeah. At this point in time when it's locked into this struggle with the United States of America, the most powerful country in the world. And it has now, as you well know, rubbed the countries in the region the wrong way, whether it's Vietnam or Indonesia or Philippines or Malaysia or what have you. And they opened up this front against India. So I can't find any logic in this. And if the belief is that China thinks years ahead and whatever have you, and this kind of myth that is built around China's wisdom and long-term anticipation of things, I think this is fantasy. I think they've committed a serious mistake. They are turning most of the world against them, though I must say that our neighbors will not support us. And a lot of Africans who have their own grievances against the West, long-standing colonialism and this and that, and anyone from China's economic strength, they will not take sides. Neither will the others. For that matter, the West. Now, just mentioned coming closer to the United States and all that. That's fine in terms of opening up space for ourselves. But as you know, even now, the statements that are coming are very balanced, asking both sides to diffuse the situation, etc. Now, what in this is that all these countries, I'm talking the Western countries, China's conduct in the South China Sea and Hong Kong and everywhere else, when it comes to confrontation with India, they equate the both countries as if both countries sort of, They may be right, they may be wrong, that kind of a thing. Therefore, the strategic autonomy business should not be misunderstood. It simply is that we are not very well assured that more prominently, more visibly, the camp of democracies and everything else, we will get the support we will get. I mean, a lot of these people in the West are very anti-Modi. They're very anti-Hindu nationalism, and on Islamic issues in India, they are taking positions which, to my mind, seem bizarre. So we have to be careful, which means that we have to continue to engage China as much as we can but bolstering up our defenses militarily. And as I said, opening up our political space. If they claim Arunachal Pradesh, why can't, in return, we give a little more space to Dalai Lama? But it should be done when they make, not 2 months later. Then it seems as if we have taken a fresh decision and it's a fresh provocation, at least step by step, progressively. And I can't see what the repercussions of that would be. What will China do? What will China do? It's not as if they're going to engage in a full-scale military conflict with us. What will they get out of it? And then, of course, there are economic levers that we must use. And I have strongly advocated that this is the time to announce the form of Huawei from the 5G trials in India. We should have an international echo, but I hope the government will do it.
So it's not just Huawei, you're saying take other measures. There are other infrastructure projects that have been on the way to the Chinese.
But they won't have the same national echo as excluding.
And again, since I know you have a lot of interviews, in essence, you're saying even though using whatever political space we can with these various countries, groupings, regions that have concerns with China, ultimately, it will have to be India and China who sort this out, right, Ambassador?
Yes. We will, of course, get support from friendly countries, especially the United States, sharing in terms of some equipment that we may need to have a better grip on the situation on the ground. I think Russia can be helpful in terms of certain things at short notice because much of our equipment still is of Russian origin. And I think they will cooperate with us on that sort of a support will come. But when it comes to political level and the relationship that other countries have with China, is far more than they have with India. And China is not going to go away. Second largest economy of the world, global supply chains in critical areas is in China. So much investment there. So people will look at China plus, and in that plus, India may come. But China will remain a factor. So therefore, we have to play our cards very intelligently, very thoughtfully, but up the ante with China politically because they've been having a free ride politically, oppose our membership of NSG, do not vote us on terrorism, make on our territory, oppose our permanent membership of the Security Council, do the CPEC and all that. So it's time that at the political level, we also did something.
And just interesting, one last thought from you, since you mentioned Russia. Now the key summit has been scheduled, and India has so far indicated that it's of course a multilateral, trilateral forum there. This won't be coming up, but should there be any preconditions, or should India say we are not going to that route? I mean, how do we play that issue with Russia and China?
Yeah, my initial reaction was precisely this. That this is not the time to have the RIC dialogue when the Chinese are sitting on our border. And especially now that we've had this brawl in the Galwan Valley where there has been casualties on both sides. And it will give a very odd signal that while this is going on, we still have space and room to talk in a trilateral format, which actually this was set up when I was Foreign Secretary, which was at that time intended to be a counter to US unilateralism. Because at that time, even Europe was very worried. Now, this is no longer there. But having discussed this issue and understood why, Russia is very, very keen that this should go on. And Russia's understanding, support is a different matter. Russia's understanding is very important. And therefore, it's not that Russia. And I think this platform will have it on good authority for India to deliver an uncomfortable message to China in a diplomatic way, but an uncomfortable manner. And therefore, I think some purpose would be served. But to answer your question pointedly, it is Russia, and the feeling that Russia should not be answered, given the kind of relationship Russia and China have built up. We need to keep Russia in play in terms of our.
Right. Ambassador Kamal Sibal, I do know you have another interview, so I thank you so much for joining us. We'll continue this discussion with Professor James Crabtree, as well as we have in London Benedict Rogers. Mr. Rogers, just coming to you when you look at these various political space that the former Foreign Secretary was talking about, that India and others should now be utilizing. A very poignant piece that you had written about, I won't be silenced, I won't be speechless, but how is India's position really viewed in Hong Kong, since you've lived there for so many years? I think you were even stopped from going there in terms of appeasing China, so as to speak, or in not speaking for Hong Kong's rights, for freedom of speech, for human rights in Hong Kong. How is it really viewed, Mr. Rogers?
I certainly think that now is the time where every country in the world, and particularly every country that is a democracy, that values democratic values and institutions, and that treasures the international rules-based order, should be standing up and speaking out for Hong Kong. What's happening in Hong Kong is not only the erosion of Hong Kong people's freedoms, autonomy, and the rule of law. It's not only the breaking of promises that were made to Hong Kongers before the handover. It's actually a flagrant breach of an international treaty, and therefore a direct assault on the international rules-based order, as we've seen in many other ways, not least on your own border, the same phenomenon, albeit in a different context and different way. And so I think it's if we believe in the international rules-based order, to stand up. So I hope India will be much more vocal, not only on its own crisis on its doorstep, but actually on Hong Kong and Xinjiang. And I mean, I agree with everything the former Foreign Secretary was saying about necessarily go as far as to say abandon the formal one China policy in terms of officially recognizing Taiwan. I'm not necessarily proposing that. We should be strengthening our relationships with Taiwan, for example, which has shown in the COVID-19 pandemic, Taiwan has shown exemplary handling of the pandemic, both in its own territory and in terms of its generosity to the world. It's a vibrant, and it is an ally, and we should be strengthening and supporting, being prepared to step in if tensions escalate on that of China's borders.
Professor, if I can come to you, Professor Crabtree, in terms of Hong Kong, we're trying to understand the Chinese should have been understood a long time back, since they understand these much in advance. But they are willing to give up Hong Kong as an international capital, to have it just as another Shenzhen, another city in China, with what's going on?
That's what it looks like. I mean, it's an interesting reflection. I agree with what the former Foreign Secretary said about when you think about what is China gaining in its current moment with India. It's not very clear. You gain a few small patches of land in the Himalayas, and one of your main strategic adversaries, in a sense, is pushed much further away from you and begins to take actions that are contrary to your interests. In Hong Kong, it's much clearer what China's are, which is that they want Hong Kong Chinese city where normal Chinese rules apply, and to get rid of this strange one country, two systems overhang. And so that appears to be what they're trying to do. And I don't think they want to lose Hong Kong's place as an international financial center, nor in fact do I think that actually they will entirely lose Hong Kong's financial center. There's plenty of finance in Shanghai. It's just that I think they've taken the decision that, given the choice between having civil unrest and democracy protests, which are risky for the regime as a whole, where they could begin to spread, or taking those in hand and in the process losing some business from Hong Kong to Singapore or where else, then that's the price worth paying. That's the calculation that they've taken.
Again, coming to the larger issue of countries that are facing problems, whether directly or indirectly, indirectly in terms of whether they have or seas, maritime boundaries or land boundaries with them. Now, the US, of course, has a trade issue. Why, in your mind, is China, like everyone is asking at this point of time, opening up so many fronts at this current juncture, say with India, is it at India getting stronger in the future? So this is possibly one of the best times to do it, the worst best time, and other countries, including India, are diverted by dealing because they have to deal with the pandemic?
Yes, I mean, I think it is hard to understand why they're opening up so many fronts at the same time. But the reason is exactly as you say, that they're taking advantage of the fact that so many countries from basically the rest of the world is so focused on the pandemic. It may also be because they are becoming aware that in fact opinion has shifted very rapidly in just the space of a few months among policymakers, dictators, and even governments towards the Chinese regime because of the pandemic. That we've seen in the UK, for example. 6 months or so ago, I, as a critic of the Chinese regime, and I want to actually make that point that my criticism is obviously of the Chinese Communist Party regime. We use China as shorthand for that regime, yes. But I'm very pro China, the country and the people. But I, as a critic of that regime, was quite a minority position in the UK. I was regarded by some in government as a bit of an irritant, and now many mainstream politicians, particularly in the governing party, the Conservative Party, but in all parties, are saying things that I was saying, a year or more ago. Maybe China is picking up on that and sees that actually because of its initial mishandling and mendacity over the virus, it's lost trust, it's lost friends, and in a sense, maybe it feels it has less to lose, therefore, by pursuing a much more aggressive expansionist policy.
Professor Crabtree, do you agree with that view that, say, like Benedict Rogers, who were in the minority a while back, now are gathering steam in terms of the world recognizing what China is? And just going back to a point that Ambassador Sybil had brought up earlier, a big ticket, say for India, even with there were indications that Huawei would be allowed despite US pressure. Is that something that is a clear signal and a big signal, say, for India in its current situation to give out that it will not allow Huawei or other Chinese into 5G, I beg your pardon, in technology, and for other countries to all follow suit as well?
I mean, I think the pattern that you're seeing now is similar to the one that you saw after the global financial crisis, which is when China began its island building in the South China Sea. The Chinese elite took a call then that the United States was off balance, that maybe it was weaker than it previously thought, and it could push forward in various different areas. And I think there does seem to be that now. In terms of Huawei, as I say, India has lots of options that it could do. It could stop importing all sorts of Chinese electronics. It could say no Huawei in the rollout of 5G. But the problem is these things come with consequences. And if you deliberately deny yourself access to the world's cheapest telecom tower and equipment provider, then your rollout is going to be slower. And so you have to use much more expensive kit from Nokia or Ericsson or somebody like that. I think it's possible that India might send a signal, for instance, by not allowing Huawei into the state telecom companies, which are very small. But if, for instance, Reliance Jio and Mukesh Ambani, I imagine, might like to think about using some Huawei kit in the next generation rollout, so might some of the other telecoms companies. So it would be a big step if India decided to do that, because it would come with real economic costs.
Mr. Rogers, just coming back to the point again that had been brought up about in the end, when it comes to India and China, you have to sort out the issue between yourselves. Ambassador Sybil pointed out, open up this political space in various fronts, diplomatically, technologically, militarily, through the economy as well, tariffs, trade. How is the UK seeing all this? When we see the US has been very careful in the statements again. He is asking both sides to disengage, though we saw what President Trump had to say before the incidents blew up in terms of India. But the UK is not really seen as one of the big players on the international stage in influencing events like this, right? The Raj is no longer the Raj. The sun has set.
Well, that's certainly true to some extent, although I think the UK could do a lot more. I mean, we're still a permanent 5 member of the Security Council, a leading voice in the G7, in NATO, the Commonwealth, of course, I think is very important. So there are all these international networks that Britain is still a leading voice in. I think Britain has, for quite some years, a very cautious approach to China. Of course, when we took a very warm approach to China up until very recently with what people called the gold relations, that clearly, I think, has gone. I mean, even Raab, albeit in understated terms, has talked about it no longer being business as usual after the pandemic, the need to review our relationship with the Chinese regime. And of course, the situation in Hong Kong has forced Britain to take a, I mean, not a very confrontational approach, but nevertheless, it's had to take an approach that it might not previously have wanted. But I hope they will speak out on the China-India situation in the same measured terms the United States has done, but play a role, obviously, given, I mean, the Raj has gone definitely, but we still have a close friendship, history, relationship with India, and we have had this engagement with China. So I hope Britain can use both to prevent the situation from escalating.
Before what happened in Ladakh and the tension between India and China over the last month or so, there was a lot of calls because of the pandemic for companies, for countries to start moving their supply chains out of China, to diversify their supply chains. You are of the firm opinion that even though that may happen in the short term or with smaller companies, you think that the memory of events is too short, being business as usual at some point of time, or do you think that the world has changed?
Well, India finds itself in a similar position to the United States and Europe, that it's realized that it's very dependent on China for various types of inputs. So your pharmaceutical industry, for instance, needs a lot of Chinese products, the generic pharmaceutical industry. Indians import an awful lot of Indian electronics, Chinese electronics. That's why the trade balance is so lopsided. So what do you then do about that? Well, you force your companies to stop importing, which is costly, or you can pick some very strategic industries and say, okay, for these strategic industries, we're going to try and make them at home. India's got some subsidy where it's making more ventilators at home. But in the end, the problem is that China is one of the world's manufacturing hubs. The one advantage India has is that not very many Indian businesses, there is no Indian equivalent of Apple or Volkswagen. There aren't that many Indian big manufacturing industries that have huge Chinese presence. The question is more imports. And I suppose the hope would be that this would provide a further kick to the government to make good on its promises, and that somehow the Chinese will give Mr. Modi a push to take some of the reform measures that are needed to turn India into a manufacturing center. You've seen some reasonably radical reforms coming out in recent weeks. Only today, the government announced that it was going to start auctioning coal blocks for private mining, which is a big change in policy. And so there's a whole series that needs to be introduced to make India an attractive manufacturing destination. And that, to, in a sense, get a leg up on China, is to make yourself a viable ordering sector. Now, at the moment, India is a long way away from that. It needs a huge amount of effort. But maybe outcomes of China's actions is it will concentrate minds in New Delhi and get people to focus more on what it would take to make India a better manufacturing location.
Mr. Rogers, on China to change its behavior when you're talking about, say, in Hong Kong or Taiwan or the Uyghurs, they all seem not very realistic in achieving what they want to. Do you think through economics, through business, countries can have a coordinated approach, at least not a change in Chinese policy?
I don't questions about the difficulty of it and the challenges involved, but yes, I think that there is some potential for that. I mean, two things that I think could make some difference. One is building on the previous discussion. I think trying to diversify our supply chain, our trading relationships. I think too many eggs have been put in the China basket, and I think if we find ways to to diversify that, to trade more with other countries, and indeed to produce, for each country to produce more themselves. That will have indirectly and ultimately directly some impact. The other thing that I've been proposing and strongly support is the implementation of targeted Magnitsky-style sanctions, which are sanctions that a growing number of countries have legislated for, and which could be applied not against China as a country or Chinese businesses, but against individuals who are for serious human rights violations. So they could be applied against officials in the central government in China, in the provincial government, and in the Hong Kong government. And I think those kind of sanctions could have some effect if, well, provided the individuals are individuals who like to travel abroad or who have assets abroad. Obviously, they make no difference if they don't. But if it's applied in that way, that may have the effect of putting pressure on individuals who may then start to increasingly question the approach that Xi Jinping and those around him are taking.
Professor Crabtree, again, we've discussed why possibly China is opening up so many fronts on so many different areas, regions. Asia and South Asia, East India itself, and we cannot forget what's happening in terms of the pandemic. Now, one of the reasons possibly that China is flexing its muscle so much is because it thinks it's coming out of that, or there are reports of a second wave. Now, when finally the world comes out of it, where do you see India, China, South Asia, America in terms of the way forward?
I mean, it gives me great pleasure to say this because I lived in India and have a great affection for the country. But I fear that India and South Asia will be, economically at least, one of the big losers from this crisis. So China is feet more quickly. Southeast Asia has been less affected. But if you look at the progress of the pandemic, unfortunately, India and Pakistan, to a lesser extent, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, all have very serious problems. There's no sign as yet that they've been able to bend down. And I think that will continue to bring this pandemic with limited fiscal resources, with overstretched healthcare systems, and with then knock-on effects for military budgets as well. So if you're thinking about what's happening with China, and instead of thinking about external balancing, about making new friends, thinking about what you can do to beef up your own resources, well, that takes money. And at the moment, much money to go around because every rupee and pound to be needed for economic support and for helping the most needy. And so I think one of the unfortunate downsides of this pandemic is that there will be a deeper divide between East and Southeast Asia, and on the one hand, and South Asia on the other, where East and Southeast Asia will be damaged by the pandemic, but get out of it more quickly, in South Asia, which is going to be in a more problem. But in a sense, that only reinforces the need for India to take matters into its own hand. That means more reforms of its domestic economy, do what it can to strengthen its domestic position, and work more craftily and cleverly to make friends in order to achieve its objectives with China. As I say, India has what it can do. It's just that this isn't happening against the most perfect of backdrops.
Professor James Crabtree, and we have Benedict Rogers from London, and Professor Crabtree. Absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank Ambassador Qamar Sibal, who joined us earlier as well. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you so much.
Sometimes there are things that get me down to deal with. But I try not to worry too much about the things that so I just accept them.
It wasn't the airplanes. It was beauty killed. born alone and you die alone, and this world just drops on top of you to make you forget those facts, but I never forget.
love I am with you. I'm trying to figure out how to talk to you about this.
Among many others.
641.
This is just another wall of our art.
philosophy is what we don't know. That's a simple definition. The questions are perpetually passing over from philosophy into as knowledge advances.
It wasn't the airplanes. It was beauty killed the beast.
born alone and you die alone, and this world drops a bunch of rules on top of you to make you forget those facts, but I never forget.
take all from how madly in love I am with you. I've been trying to figure out how to talk to you about this.
How many others?
141.
passing over from philosophy into science. Yes, knowledge advances.
这时，我2015年3月12号在伦敦和英国的90公斤开枪王巴西，他开始 欧洲 MMA 国际冠军，他的名字叫皮特厄丁。实打的录像就是比武的录像，这里面就有一个接话法动作，挨劲打法，就是要打接话法，4两拨千斤。他出手了，我接住以后打了他。
这个导演说是，你们是试一试还是真打？我说都really，就是真打。这个3手是打了6，后来打完以后，他就是手都出不来。就是他一出手，你看我接住他人都不能跳，是他的速度不如我，但是我没有真正用快拳打。如果快拳打就没法拍电影了，他是接不住的。后来我和他折3下，我没有出电了。
裁判是我们成都第一裁判道馆的马玉文判定。首先站在我左手旁，ladies and gentlemen, fighter from motherfucking Beijing。大家也不用说，我也不用过多的介绍。徐晓东，传统武术代表雷公太极。 生活在成都的北京人，雷公太极，雷公掌声来一遍！把给你的马人发个兴奋吧，兴奋就把你最好的掌声来！
及时的，好，对我的小狗儿呀，靠狗，直接来吧！安静。哎去，好去，我就说是一个很扯淡的比赛。丢了。你好兴奋啊！你真棒！感到110。结束了吗？这个赶紧了，我传给了几分多，不给了。Everybody， 还能继续吗？一个啊，不是，他没得那个，没得。快点，勇敢，加油！来，不要走，我来说，好吧？你说。 来，观众朋友们，首先记得是2个人在做比赛，不是啥东西。首先，我们还是说的，虽然说查岗体验拔出全中国赢，但前提还是要有安全。马老师来认为吧，既然是本场比赛见证的，马老师觉得如果在进行，或者是不愿意，我们也让他继续。 来，把中间来，首先起头，干嘛，也许双方选手呢，中间。他可以选一个，还行吧。只有氧。气氛大多紧张呢，下一下啊！这场比赛我们也只是一个见证。正规比赛这个谈不上，就是一乐，祝大家更开心。谁是谁非，郭老倌自己自有公论。这里面呢，我们也不多说。我们也非常感谢主教授，导演，我们也请老师掌声送给他来。
Welcome to Bruce Lee Real Fight channel. Today we are going to talk about Bruce Lee's 1-inch punch. The 1-inch punch is a punching technique performed at a range of 0 to 1 inch. It is originally a punching exercise from Wing Chun, which known as explosive force movement. Bruce Lee learned this technique from his Wing Chun training in Hong Kong and later on it. He improved the technique power and make it more effective. In 1967 Long Beach International Karate Championships, Bruce Lee showed the 1-inch punch to the world in front of television for the first time. He explains the 1-inch punch is quantitatively using a force gauge. As you can see from the footage here, Bruce Lee invited Joe Louis on stage to on the left. The guy is about 6 foot tall and he just slightly go backward. Then Bruce Lee demonstrates the 6-inch punch on the same guy. Look at the footage here. Still need more words? Bruce Lee invited Joe Louis on stage again to demonstrate the real 1-inch punch. Again, look at the footage here. Joe Louis was born in 1944. He was an American kickboxer and has twice been voted the greatest fighter in karate history. He has won a number of karate tournaments and often considered as the greatest karate fighter. So, what do you think after watching the footage of Bruce Lee's 1-inch punch? Not to forget that the person who takes the punch is a world heavyweight karate Joe Louis. Please leave your comment below, we would like to hear from you. Last but not least, if you love our videos, please like, share, subscribe and ring the notification.
This is what it is, okay? I said empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup. It becomes the cup. You put water, comes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow, can crash. Be water, my friend.
啲行徑有乜辛苦？日啱打黑色衫，我哋嘅後生仔好心啊！啲行徑天沙咁樣，日日爭取打家教，又破壞香港。打全外，打全打議員，打議員，打圈仔，打圈仔，打死黑警啊！死黑警做嘢又唔喐書，死黑警點解我嘅唔中意？開一啲睇。我哋黑警啊，全家仔女都喊，死黑警，我冇罪㗎，我咧黑警就係我哋就黑警，日日鬧事，黑警破壞香港法例，勁破壞香港法例，黑警就係我哋就人。黑警日日鬧事，黑警破壞香港法例，黑警破壞香港法例，香港法例。